Okay, so the US Pointer Study, which this is an acronym for the US Study to Protect Brain Health through Lifestyle Intervention to Reduce Risk. And thank goodness that in science, everything has an acronym that simplifies, and sometimes you have to try and figure out where the letters come from. So as you can see, you could entertain yourself trying to figure out where you get pointer out of that long name. But that's what I'm gonna explain some of the background of how we get to thinking about this study. And as Peggy mentioned, Richard Elbein with the Alzheimer's Association, Houston and Southeast Texas chapter. So the Alzheimer's Association is really all about people and science. And if you've seen our logo before, you may have wondered, what is that supposed to be? So you can see that on the left side, it's supposed to represent the head of a person. And on the right side, it represents science. So that's a beaker. And so it's representing science. And our organization brings together the importance of science and the critical nature of recognizing that Alzheimer's and dementia affect people. And we bring those together and try and address those two areas. The Alzheimer's Association is a global organization that is working around the world to advance care and support and to promote research. Wherever the best research is going to happen, we want to make sure that it happens and that we're able to share that information. So every year, the Alzheimer's Association puts together a booklet of the facts and figures trying to identify what's happening in the area of Alzheimer's and dementia and how is that affecting people in the United States. And so this year's facts and figures, this is just a few of the facts that you could find in the facts and figures. And so you may or may not have heard that Alzheimer's is the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. It's kind of a shocking number to think about. And that about, well, more than 5 million people are affected by Alzheimer's disease, living with the disease currently. And then it affects a lot of other people because they have 16 million caregivers who are not paid to provide care for them. Kind of some other shocking things is that 1 in 3 seniors dies from Alzheimer's or some form of dementia. That's a huge number of people. And that it's a very expensive disease. It's the most expensive disease in America. And so all of those, if you put it together, you can start to understand the motivation for the Alzheimer's Association and our supporters to find some intervention, all right, it wants me to move forward, to find some intervention that will change the trajectory of this disease and the impact on Americans. So among the ways that we try and influence finding those better treatments or a cure is that the Alzheimer's Association is involved with advocacy. And we're interested in making sure that the US government is funding Alzheimer's research. And so you can see a decade ago, the total funding for Alzheimer's research was less than $500 million. And I mean, that's not very much money if you were to compare it to the other diseases in the top 10 that are being studied that impact Americans' lives. This was not very much money. And the Alzheimer's Association has been mobilizing volunteers to help us influence our elected officials and to educate them about the impact of Alzheimer's disease on American families and on the opportunity for us to invest in more research which would find better treatments sooner. And so you can see in the last decade, we've gone from under $500 million to $2.8 billion in research. And that's a result of very aggressive advocacy work by the Alzheimer's Association. So when we talk about Alzheimer's and dementia, often people are not exactly sure or have different ideas about what the term dementia actually means. So think about dementia as an umbrella term that describes a whole range of different symptoms that are associated with cognitive impairment. So some kind of cognitive impact, and there are many different causes of dementia. The most common cause of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. Somewhere between 60 and 80% of folks with dementia have Alzheimer's disease. And then there are other causes: vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia are among the top. And any of those, when you hear the term dementia, which could be used to describe someone with Alzheimer's or those other causes, they're describing a collection of symptoms. And those symptoms may include cognitive changes, but they also could include behavioral or psychological symptoms. And the cause of them is something biological in nature. So the structure of the brain is changing to explain those symptoms. And so something that is kind of interesting, if you look at the gray bar across the bottom, you'll notice it says mixed dementia, which means that a person has more than one neuropathology. So that means they could have Alzheimer's and Lewy bodies, or they could have vascular and frontotemporal, or any combination of dementias. That represents about 50% of the folks who have Alzheimer's and dementia, that about half of them have more than one cause of the neuropathology. So interesting to know. So of course, the immediate thing that everyone wants to talk about is risk factors. So first of all, let's talk about the age impact. And you can see that if you look at that, that pie chart, you'll see that most everyone is over the age of 65. Only 200,000 people are under the age of 65 and affected by Alzheimer's dementia. So it's a huge number if you think about it and you're under 65. It leaves the lion's share, which is 5.6 million people who are over the age of 65. And of those 5.6 million, the majority of them are in the 75 to 84 year category. What we know is that as people age, their risk of developing Alzheimer's increases. And so if we talk about the risk factors, first of all, it's important to know that Alzheimer's is not normal aging. It's not typical. You don't just develop Alzheimer's because you're old. You develop Alzheimer's or some form of dementia because there's some disease process happening. And so the biggest risk factor is age, which you saw on the left side of the screen. Genetics is another important risk factor. The most studied gene associated with increased risk is ApoE4, which you may have heard people talk about. So that's one of many genes that can increase risk of Alzheimer's. It just happens to be the most well studied. And we know that there's an increased risk for someone who has a family history. So a first degree relative with Alzheimer's increases risk. And then there are a range of other risk factors that can be considered, and we'll just call those lifestyle risk factors. So cardiovascular disease increases risk. Lack of social stimulation seems to increase risk. Lack of cognitive stimulation has an impact. Education, particularly early education. So education early in life lack of education early in life seems to be a risk factor. Traumatic brain injury is a risk factor. Disrupted sleep is a risk factor. Impaired hearing, so if someone's hearing, even mild to moderate hearing loss that's not corrected, could increase risk. Sleep apnea. So there are a number of risk factors that affect the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. What we've learned over the years that the Alzheimer's Association has been funding research and has been tracking research globally is that, and I think probably you're all aware that there's currently no effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease. There are some therapies. Okay, let's go back. Sorry about that. So there are some treatments that address the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So the equivalent would be if you have a cold, you could take something that may stop you from sniffling, but it doesn't stop the cold. That's the kind of drugs that are currently available to treat Alzheimer's disease. They treat some of the symptoms over some period of time. They have some effectiveness over a window of time, but there's nothing that treats the disease itself. And so there's now more and more of a growing understanding that perhaps we need to be looking at both lifestyle interventions as well as medications as a way to address Alzheimer's disease. So when we think about those lifestyle interventions, they're the ones that we talk about all the time. You can think of any of the chronic debilitating diseases and you'll have some conversation about the same lifestyle issues. So one would be exercise, regular exercise. And we know that aerobic exercise, obviously, when you do aerobic activity, you're pumping blood that's going through your entire system. It's going through your system faster. It's aerated, so it's bringing oxygen into the brain, which is important. So that aerobic exercise may provide some protection to the brain. It also may improve cognitive function, particularly in older adults. So there's some benefit from exercise. Diet seems to perhaps have some benefit. So again, we've probably all heard discussions about a balanced diet being important. Perhaps there's some benefit to particular kinds of diets. We've talked about with heart disease, you've heard a lot about the Mediterranean diet and the benefits of lots of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and fish. So there may be some benefit to a dietary change that may reduce risk of cognitive decline. And so you see the MIND diet. We'll talk a little bit more about each of these in a minute. And so then we can think about cognitive and social stimulation. We know that there's an impact of education. We know there's an impact of social isolation, that social isolation is not good for the brain, and that social isolation may impact brain health and increase the risk of dementia. And of course, if you have been following the news, particularly about some of the restrictions in senior living communities to try and protect seniors from COVID-19, there's now the discussion that this social isolation that has been enforced as a way to perhaps have seniors be safer may also have a negative impact on their brain health and may be increasing the risk of dementia. And then finally, heart health, particularly thinking about blood pressure and blood sugar, that uncontrolled elevated blood pressure or elevated blood sugars may increase the risk of cognitive impairment and again, may have an impact on dementia. So having regular health monitoring and health management perhaps is important. So those are examples of lifestyle interventions. So when we think about exercise, what we know is that when people exercise, they're building overall strength. And that overall strength, what we see in older adults is that it also helps with mobility. So their risk of falling is reduced. Their ability to then participate in activities is improved. There's some impact on sleep. And remember, I mentioned sleep is its own risk factor for Alzheimer's and other dementia. So exercise, if it's improving sleep, then it may be a secondary benefit. There may be an effect on depression and an effect on anxiety. So all of those benefits from exercise before we even think about the fact that exercise itself may be improving blood flow into the brain, which is bringing in oxygen and removing some of the waste products. So all of those things are positive about exercise. Then when we think about diet and say, okay, we've heard about diet for all kinds of things, for cancer, for heart disease. to lower risk of diabetes, to maintain appropriate weight. All of those are related to diet. So we know that foods can affect overall health, and we're going to assume that there's some impact perhaps on the brain, and that it also, a healthy diet and a diet that truly regulates blood sugar and hypertension, that they reduce the risk of diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. And all of those are risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So once again, we're directly and indirectly perhaps changing the risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. And then there are some studies which suggest that diet may affect memory. So one of these studies, which was conducted at Rush University in Chicago, was looking at a dietary intervention. And they were interested in taking the Mediterranean diet that you've, I'm sure, heard a lot about. And the studies that say people who eat the Mediterranean diet have lower stress, and they have longevity, and everything seems to be just better, beyond the fact that they're living on a Greek island. Maybe there's something about the diet. And then there's a diet called the DASH diet, which is specifically designed to address hypertension. So this group in Chicago said, let's combine the best of these two diets, which is the Mediterranean and the DASH diet, into what they called the MIND diet. And again, you can see the acronym. They take the M from Mediterranean and the I from intervention and the N from neurodegenerative and the D from delay, and they get MIND. So they combine these two diets, and it's a fairly aggressive study. So this study was almost 1,000 adults, so older adults. It went on for almost 5 years, and the average age of the participants was 80. So definitely an older adult population. And then they tracked their adherence to the study and then looked at their cognitive functioning over time. And it's pretty compelling that in folks who rigorously adhered to this study, to this diet, they lowered their risk of cognitive change by 53%. I'll tell you, we don't have a drug that can do anything like that. So that's a very compelling number. And that the people who adhered to this study functioned like someone 7.5 years younger in terms of their cognitive abilities. Even people who only moderately adhered to the diet had a lowered risk by 35%. So this is very compelling and very exciting, actually, that a diet alone had this kind of impact. So the MIND diet, of course, everybody now wants to know, what do I need to eat to follow this diet? Because I'm ready to do it and have a brain 7.5 years younger than my age. Sounds great. So I will tell you, the MIND diet is a challenging diet to follow. It's absolutely healthy, and it's absolutely, it can be done, but it's not for the faint of heart, because it is very particular about what is on the diet. So it's easy to understand, it's just hard to do. The MIND diet basically divides the world into two groups: foods that are allowed and can be eaten, and foods that are not allowed and really should be limited. And so what I'm showing you is just the allowed part. It's better to focus on what you can do than what you're not supposed to do. And you can kind of intuit that if it's not on this list, you're probably not supposed to do it. So you can see that, big surprise, green leafy vegetables, eat them, enjoy them. Other vegetables, and there's a whole list of vegetables. Vegetables are good, including nuts in the diet. Again, good thing. Now, this is not a weight control diet, because you may say nuts, those are high in fat, but they're very healthy. And so this is not to control weight. This is really a diet that's focused on health. So eating nuts on a regular basis, berries, and it's not every berry in the universe. Not all berries are created equal. So you can see they're specifically mentioned: blueberries, strawberries, raspberries, blackberries. Those are the winter berries. And then incorporating legumes on a regular basis. So all those different kind of beans, whole grains. So it specifically mentions whole grains, which is because those processed grains are really not so great, and so they're not mentioned on the include side. Fish is good. You can tell that came straight out of the Mediterranean diet, and but it's not fried fish. It's baked and broiled, but not fried. Poultry, skinless chicken or turkey, you're eating the white meat, and again, not fried. So this is not Chick-fil-A chicken. This is not a nice broiled chicken. And then including extra virgin olive oil as the primary fat that's being added to the diet. And you see, it's not just olive oil, but specifically extra virgin olive oil. So this gives you an idea of the kinds of foods that are included on the MIND diet. If I didn't mention them and you say, what about? If you're asking what about, it's probably on the list of things you should be limiting. So, and if you want more about, we can talk about the MIND diet, and also I can share a link to more about that diet. Then when we think about cognitive activity, so the cognitive stimulation, again, we know that isolation is a problem, education is important, and stimulation is important. So thinking about ways to stimulate your brain is important. It's great if you can figure out a way to do it and include someone else, whether you're playing Scrabble or learning to dance and learning new dance steps where you're having to learn something new, or learning to play an instrument. So there are lots of ways to cognitively stimulate your brain. It could be that Peggy mentioned that she has book clubs. So if you were part of a book club where you're reading a novel and then discussing it, that would be cognitively stimulating. And also it would speak to social isolation. So it's good to do something that you enjoy, that is purposeful is even better. And the best, like I said, is if you can combine mental and physical activities. So then we move on to thinking about cardiovascular disease. And this study, I particularly want to highlight this study because it was such again, a kind of groundbreaking study. So this was a study that was very large. The Sprint Mind study had more than 9,000 participants, which is massive for a study, and it was all older adults, so people over 50. For those of you who don't think 50 is old, ask AARP, they'll tell you you are. And it was looking at blood pressure issues. And so the study was comparing, at that time when the study started, the standard of care, which was to control a person's blood pressure to their systolic to below 140, so 140 or below. So that was the standard treatment, and it was compared to an intensive treatment, which was bringing a person's blood pressure down to 120 or below. And the standard of care over the time that this study, from when it started to now, is different. But I can tell you 140 was, people thought they were doing well if they were controlling to 140. And 120 was often thought of as dangerous because people would get dizzy from the intervention. So there were a lot of reasons that 120 was just not even considered. So this study looked at that, and the study was actually stopped early because there was such a big difference in the risk of dementia among people who had the intensive treatment as compared with the standard of care. And so you see on the right, some of the findings were that there was a 19% reduction among the folks with that intensive treatment, blood pressure 120 or below. They had a 19% reduction in the risk of mild cognitive impairment. They had a 17% reduction in the risk of dementia, and the combined risk was 15% combined between mild cognitive impairment and dementia. So just to give you a frame for that mild cognitive impairment, everyone who develops Alzheimer's or dementia passes through a stage where they have mild cognitive impairment. So if you think of it as a continuum, that 19% reduction at the mild cognitive impairment stage has an impact on the later numbers of folks with dementia. So this is a huge study. It definitely informs how we should be thinking about managing heart health. So at about the same time, there have been studies that have looked at lifestyle, and from looking at lots of different studies and trying to combine them together to understand without actually conducting a study, but saying, well, what does it look like, these different lifestyle interventions? So what about diet and this rigorous physical activity? What does that impact? And if we were to make sure that we're managing alcohol intake, doing something about smoking cessation, which is a risk factor also, and providing cognitive stimulation. So if we look at those 5 lifestyle factors and then try and calculate what is the risk factor of each of them, or how about if we combine them. And so these studies said, you know, if we could combine 4 or 5 of these risk factors, modifying their lifestyle, we could reduce their risk of Alzheimer's by 59%, 4 or 5 of them. And even if we just did 2 or 3 of them, that might be a 39% risk reduction. Now, this is just these 5 factors: diet, activity, alcohol, smoking, and cognitive stimulation. So again, you're getting the background of how we end up then thinking about cuckoo clock, I apologize. So thinking about maybe we should do a study that really does combine these different lifestyle interventions, and let's see what happens. So the Alzheimer's Association funded a study that was conducted in Finland. It had researchers from Sweden and Finland that were looking at this. It was a 2-year study looking at lifestyle intervention, and it had about 1,300 cognitively healthy older adults, 60 to 77 years old, who were increased risk because of their medical conditions. So some of those risk factors like heart disease, diabetes, excess weight, lack of activity. So this study looked at folks that were in that category, and they then were in a lifestyle study that was 2 years. And that 2-year study saw, as a result of the 2-year intervention, so the intervention is the top bar, and the standard of care in Finland is just normal medical care, which of course is socialized medicine, but not as intensive, not as aggressive, did not include the other lifestyle interventions. And there was a significant difference in cognitive function at the end of a 2-year study. So that's pretty exciting to see that this lifestyle intervention had an impact in 2 years on older adults. So that's great. But then, you wonder, well, that's great, but that's in Finland. And Finland is a pretty homogeneous society. They're all more or less from the same stock. And it's a socialized country. They have socialized medicine. They do many things in groups. So it's a very social, shared kind of approach to the world. So then the question is, what would that look like outside of Finland? And so the idea of the US Pointer study is to say, okay, well, what we learned from the finger study, could we repeat that in a place as diverse as America, and with the lifestyles that exist in America? So there was, of course, the challenge of how do we adapt this finger study, those lifestyle interventions, into the culture of America, which also there's not one universal culture. It's very different from one side of the country to the other and across the breadbasket in the middle. And then, unlike Finland, that what they learned, they were able to then immediately implement because they have socialized healthcare. So could we create some kind of an infrastructure that would allow a program to be sustained once we learn if there is a benefit from those interventions? And so we end up with the US Pointer study, which, like the finger study, is a 2-year study. It's So people participate in the study for 2 years. There are 2 groups of people. There's a self-guided group and a structured group, which I'll talk a little more about. And then there are sites around the country. So this study is being conducted in 5 sites across the United States: North Carolina, Chicago, Northern California, Rhode Island, and Houston is one of those 5 sites, which we're very proud about, that Houston is one of the locations. The total participants in the study nationwide is 2,000. Each one of these locations will recruit 400 participants to participate in the study. Those participants will then be randomized into one of 2 different interventions. As I mentioned, there's a structured and a self-guided, and they will participate in the study for 2 years. So the 2 studies, or the 2 lifestyle interventions are essentially doing the same things. They're learning about the impact of activity, nutrition, stimulation, cognitive stimulation, and healthy lifestyle or health coaching. And the difference is just one, they're learning about it, and then they're managing those interventions themselves, and the other has a very structured approach. And so again, we're trying to understand in America what works best in trying to modify lifestyle. So those sites across the country, geographically, you can see where they are. These are very different parts of the country. If you think about the South, the New England states, California, which is its own country, really all by itself, the breadbasket Midwest, and the Southwest, the Houston. And the populations are very different. The composition, the diversity, all very different. And so we're looking to recruit people in each one of these sites. We're looking to recruit a cohort of people that's reflective of the communities where those sites are located. In order to participate, person in the US Pointer study, we're looking for people 60 to 79 years old. Ideally, they're not people who are already exercising regularly, so maybe on the sliding scale more towards a couch potato than towards a triathlete. They need to have normal cognition, so no memory impairment themselves. We're looking for them to have a first-degree relative with some memory loss, so they have some risk. So you can tell these are all risk factors for Alzheimer's and dementia. And then there are additional criteria that will be discussed at screening, but of course it could include elevated blood sugar or hypertension. So there are other risk factors that are part of the screening. So the intervention includes some social engagement, some cognitive stimulation, a diet modification, which is a healthier diet, and then rigorous exercise. So you can see it's a fairly aggressive exercise approach to address all of the things that we talked about that may be that are perhaps risk factors and perhaps offer some benefit. So in Houston, we have a number of partners in this study. So the Baylor College of Medicine, the Alzheimer's Disease and Memory Disorder Center is the overall project managers. The principal investigators are Dr. Valerie Pavlik and Dr. Melissa Yu. They're co-principal investigators. And Baylor College of Medicine is involved with recruitment. They're screening the subjects. They're managing the evaluation and, of course, managing the overall project. Kelsey Research Foundation is also involved with recruitment, and they're delivering the intervention. Ashley Alexander is the collaborator for this part of the study. And then the Alzheimer's Association, Houston and Southeast Texas, is also assisting with recruitment, and we're part of the intervention delivery as well. And you see my name on there, and my colleague Anne-Marie McDonald is also helping to manage our involvement. And the Alzheimer's Association will be the organization that helps create that structure across the country that would help deliver. As we learn that lifestyle interventions are effective, we would be the network across the country to provide that community support. So also interesting for this study is that the original study was identified and funded by the Alzheimer's Association, but we were very excited that there then was additional funding that came from the National Institutes on Aging. So National Institutes on Aging is part of the National Institutes of Health, and they were very interested in this study and wanted to pile on and say, well, if this study is going to happen, we want to learn more about this study by adding some things. So they would like to have neuroimaging done. So there's a $47 million additional funding from NIA to look at neuroimaging. In the Houston area, the neuroimaging is being led by Houston Methodist, the Nance National Alzheimer's Center, Dr. Joe Masdu. So we're excited about that. There also is a US pointer sleep study add-on, which is I think $5 or $6 million looking at sleep, because remember we talked about sleep disturbance being a risk for Alzheimer's and dementia. So there's a sleep study component that's being added. And then there's also a microbiome study that's being added on to look at these dietary changes that are being made. How does that affect the gut microbiome, and what is the relationship between those gut microbiome changes and cognitive function in the participants? So very interesting additional information that we will learn as a result of this study. So I'm sure that the big question is, well, this sounds great. How do we get involved? So I will say that in order to participate, it's really important to be within the geography of one of the 5 sites. So I know that there are people interested who live in far places like Dallas or Fort Worth or El Paso, even Austin or San Antonio. And I would say that it's probably very difficult to live in a different city and participate in this study. So probably the Houston Metroplex for our area would be the geography that makes sense to think about participating. And if you think that you might be appropriate, you can call 713-798-5452, or you can visit the website alz.org/US-pointer. And from there, you will be directed to be able to fill out, either call and you'll give the information, or online. And you can then go through some screening. And if appropriate, you would come in for an in-person screening to participate in the study. So also exciting is that while Finger was interesting and exciting by itself, and US Pointer is even more exciting and obviously relevant to us in the United States, we're part of what has become a global network. So US Pointer is just one of many studies being conducted globally that are looking at this same cluster of lifestyle interventions as a way to understand whether we can bend the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease. So you can see all of the shaded areas. There are Finger type studies happening, or US Pointer type studies happening. And the Alzheimer's Association is the convener of all of them, is the one that's helping to standardize the way data is collected so that we'll be able to actually learn, because as you can imagine, the diet in the United States is nothing like the diet in India. And so the interventions look different. The kind of exercise that a woman might do in the United States is very different than what a woman in China might do for exercise. And yet we're trying to compare these interventions. So you can see China, Japan, India, Singapore, Australia, almost all of Latin America, Canada, Mexico, and most of Europe. So very exciting that these are all happening at about the same time. So you may or may not be able to participate in the US Pointer study. Certainly there are other opportunities. It's important that you are aware of what your risk factors are for Alzheimer's and dementia, and that you think about ways to reduce your risk. It's helpful to learn about the research that's happening and the importance of participating. We can all help advance the science by participating in clinical trials. So, so that's another way to be helpful. And then to really demand to fully understand the science. So, you know, reading an article in the Houston Chronicle, which goes through, there may be some drama involved to make it a good story, may not really tell the whole story about what the science is and is not informing us. So becoming more informed. So we can help with all of this. The Alzheimer's Association offers a program called Trial Match. My colleagues say Trial Match is like an online dating service for Alzheimer's research. And so you go to alz.org/trialmatch to sign up. Everyone can sign up, whether you have cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's or you don't. Either way, we need both healthy controls as well as people with the disease to participate in studies. And there are all kinds of studies that happen in our area. I mean, we're a very robust research location, the Houston area, and as well as many places in the country. And so you sign up for Trial Match, you give them some basic information about yourself, and as clinical studies come up, if you match for those clinical studies, you're contacted and given the opportunity to participate. You are not committing by signing up for Trial Match. You are committing to nothing except being notified. And there are studies that are everything from just filling out a survey to being involved with some kind of intensive study. So whatever it is, you could learn about it and potentially participate. And then you can just learn about what research is being published and what the research means by signing up for the Alzheimer's Association Science Hub. This is available on your mobile device. You can download it from the Apple App Store or from the Google, Android Google Play Store, and you just download it. It gives you information about the latest published research, as well as some interpretation about what does this actually mean. You're not going to get the CNN Fox News version. You're going to get the scientists are looking at this and here's the takeaway from this study. So it's very helpful. We at the Alzheimer's Association read it and refer to it regularly, and it's great. You'll know as much as we know in the same time frame as we know it. And so with all of that, you can help us with our vision, which is a world without Alzheimer's disease and all other dementia. And we will get there by conducting research such as US Pointer and some of the other studies that you may learn about from Trial Match, and by helping to support our cause. And I appreciate your taking the time to learn about the US Pointer study. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can then take questions.
So Richard, there's one question in the chat room about whether you're willing to share your presentation slides with folks.
That's a great question. And, you know, let me confirm that I can with, with our US Pointer site. So let me find that out. And then if you, Peggy, if you can collect the email addresses, and if I'm allowed to, I will share them. I know some I can. There are some that are from US Pointer and I don't know if I'm allowed to or not.
Okay, terrific. Thanks. Cody can send them out to all the people who have signed up.
Absolutely. Happy.
And we're also, by the way, we're recording this, and this will be on our website in a day or two, so people can watch it at their leisure. or refer people to watch it at their leisure
Yeah, perfect.
if they weren't able to join us for the specific time. Are there other questions? If you have a question, please unmute yourself, and you can even turn your video on if you are able. No questions?
Don't be shy. I'm happy to tell you everything I know, which will take about 15 seconds, about anything you want to know. I will say that when we think about lifestyle interventions, it's an interesting topic because we've all heard about lifestyle interventions around, for example, heart disease. We've been talking about those for decades. And that, of course, came out of a study that really changed the way we understood heart disease from Framingham, Massachusetts. And I would say that this US Pointer study is the Alzheimer's equivalent to the Framingham study that was conducted years ago for us to really understand that, for example, smoking makes a difference with heart disease. And maybe eating a diet high in cholesterol has an impact on heart disease. So we learned a lot. And the other interesting thing about all of our learnings from the Framingham study is how much we don't typically apply in our day-to-day life. So in spite of the fact that we probably all know that having a lot of fried foods is probably not healthy, and perhaps eating a lot of high sugar foods is not healthy, and that there probably are issues, for example, particularly around, if we think about cancers, particularly cancers of the digestive tract, we know that processed foods are a problem and high-fat foods are a problem. And yet, if any one of us were to look at our diet for one day, I imagine that we violate most of those. And so I think that's interesting that that part of the challenge when I think about this US Pointer study is that we're going to probably learn some very compelling lifestyle interventions that would make a difference. And I wonder how many of us will actually modify our lifestyle in response to those, and how many of us have modified the ones that we already know about.
So there's one more question I'll get to in a minute, but I have a question. So the study itself is 2 years. Is there an intent to follow on after those 2 years to check the long-term?
It's a great question. So what happened in the finger study is the finger study was a 2-year study, which meant that the initial funding to monitor those participants was 2 years long. What happened was that they then, there was enough interest that there ended up being additional funding, and those people are now being followed longer term. Okay. So at this point, there is no funding for the longer term, but there's every reason to believe that once you invest, we're talking between the NIA funding and the Alzheimer's Association funding, this study is already close to $100 million.
Right.
So there's every reason to believe that this would be a group of participants worthy of studying long-term. And by the way, that is what happened in the Framingham study. The original study was a fairly short-term study, but Framingham study has gone on now for multi-generations, looking at the impact of heart disease and lifestyle changes. And it's expanded beyond that original cohort to the next generation and even the next generation. So yes, I would expect that there will be a longer term participation, but at this point, the money's not there. We're still working on the money to fund the initial study.
So there's a question here. Do you have any upcoming online programs on lifestyle, nutrition, et cetera, at the Alzheimer's Association that families could attend to learn more for brain health?
So yes, the Alzheimer's Association offers programs about healthy living. And again, we can share the link to those programs pretty much every week. there's a healthy living
Yeah.
program that's available. And I think my colleague Alexis Eaton may have shared something in the chat.
Yeah, she's just put a link,
Link. Perfect. Thank you, Alexis.
www.alts.org/texas/helping you education/education.
Yeah. And so healthy living is one that talks about lifestyle and diet.
Yeah. I'll have Cody pick that up and put that in the email when he sends other stuff out.
Perfect. Perfect. And I think that question came from Connie. So thank you, Connie, for that question.
Any other questions? We're about out of time, but thank you for attending today, and a special thanks to Richard for spending his valuable time with us today. I think this is, oh, here's another question. One more question real quick. I've heard different things regarding the value of getting some type of cognitive baseline. Can you comment on the value of doing or not doing that?
So cognitive baseline, it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
So what I'll say is that when I started to believe that there were concerns about my mother, the way I explained to her that I thought it was important to do neuropsychological testing was the same way that when she reached a certain age and based on the family history of cardiovascular disease, that she went in for essentially a baseline, an understanding of what her cardiovascular health was and an assessment. And of course, there were issues because of our family history of cardiovascular disease. We similarly have a history, which I think you mentioned, Peggy, of dementia within the family. And so there probably is some point, especially if you have some initial concerns about your cognitive functioning, that it may make sense to go in and have neuropsychological testing to understand whether you're actually functioning at 100% for your age and level of education, or if there are areas of deficit. Yeah. But I would say just, as just a healthy, free range adult, for instance, for me at this moment, I haven't noticed anything that's concerning. So to go in and have neuropsychological testing, it's expensive, it's time consuming, and I'm not sure that it would tell you much. But I would say at the beginnings of any level of concern, neuropsychological testing as part of an overall evaluation, which includes an overall evaluation of your health, your current medical and physical and cognitive health, is a great idea, because then over time you can track if there are actually changes, or if you're just, we do all have cognitive changes as a result of aging. There's just a big difference between those changes and changes that are indicators of some kind of disease process.
Well, I know Dr. Paul Schultz from the medical center has spoken at the Hope and Healing Center, and his advice was similar to yours, that as soon as you...
That's good. I'm glad I agree with him.
But his comment was, as soon as you suspect something, get tested, because the medications that we do have only work early on. And if you wait too long, then the meds don't work anymore.
Yeah, and also I will say that way before anyone else would observe cognitive changes, I would observe those cognitive changes in myself. By the time someone else, even a very close loved one, can notice cognitive changes in me, it's advanced much beyond where I would have said, oh, that's weird. I used to be able to do this thing, and now I'm finding myself having challenges doing this thing, whatever it is, whether it's wayfinding or remembering where I've placed things, or balancing the checkbook. So it can be all kinds of different issues. But I would say that when I start to think, this is not quite normal for me, that's a good time to have an evaluation.
All right. Well, thank you so much again, Richard. We do appreciate it. And I hope some of you will be interested enough in this to sign up for the Pointer study or to recommend it to your family and friends.
Can you maybe the question I just put in the chat
Oh, sorry.
quickly? I mean, I know it's the last minute.
Can
I'm an adult
baseline,
child of a
that's a good question. Can baseline testing information have a negative insurance effect? In, for example, a seemingly pre-existing condition. There's some concern of adult children who have an aging parent with Alzheimer's that if they go get tested or do a baseline, that it may be problematic in our health history.
It's a
That
very
sort of depends on what happens with the national pre-existing program, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think there are lots of questions that brings up, and again, you know, it's the same question that you would ask. Honestly, you'd ask the same question whether you're talking about, is that a reason not to have a colonoscopy or to have one? Is it a reason not to go in and have, you know, if you know you have a risk of cardiovascular disease, would you not ever go to a cardiologist because of the fear of the impact? And so at some point you're balancing what might that do to my insurance versus is there some intervention that I would do differently if I understood that I now had elevated cholesterol and needed to be on cholestyramines? Or, you know, I mean, we think about all the different disease risk factors that we are monitoring, and all of them ultimately end up in our medical record and can adversely affect our ability to get insurance. So, so compared to some of the others, this one probably has a lower risk impact in the immediate term. But I don't know that I would go in and just as part of my screening at age 50 or 55 or 60 or 65, have a neuropsychological testing unless there were some reasons that I had to suspect that maybe everything was not normal.
Thanks, Richard.
I don't know that really gave a thorough answer, but.
Well, I think that leads, if you can't get away from the political ads right now, but the whole issue of pre-existing conditions is a big one.
Yeah.
And I would encourage everybody to pay attention to that discussion because it's going to affect all of us, even to the degree that when you get on Medicare and look for a Medicare supplement, it will affect your pricing.
Well, and it affects life insurance, and I mean, it affects a whole range of discoverables. And I think to this person's question, anything that's in your medical record is discoverable. I'll just say that's important to understand and to appreciate. And even, you know, 23andMe, if you say, well, I'm going to go that route, it's potentially discoverable. So it's important to be aware of what information you are then putting into the universe that could be discoverable.
Exactly.
So thank you all so much.
Thank you.